This is the Doing Virtue podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Criste. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Brian Hicks and Mark LaRochelle. Tonight, we had the pleasure of having on a renowned author and speaker and podcaster, Dr. Michael Foley. He is a professor of patristics at Baylor University. He's most well known for his book, Drinking with the Saints. He also has a sequel, which we would highly recommend, Drinking with Saint Nick. He just released a book earlier this year called Cooking with the Saints, which he co-wrote with Father Leo Petalinghung. And most recently, about a month ago, he released a book called Lost in Translation, which we would also recommend. We were very honored to have him on our show. For more information, please look him up online. You can find him online at drinkingwiththesaints.com. He also has a podcast called Drinking with the Saints. Him and his wife, Alexandra, are leading and hosting a pilgrimage to Croatia, and there are still spots available. For all of this information, for book links, podcast links, website links, and some extra lectures and articles by Dr. Foley, please look in our Spotify notes. All of those are there for you. Again, we're really thankful to have Dr. Michael on the podcast, and we hope that we'll be able to have him on again in the future. We hope that all of you have a happy and blessed Advent season. Please check out his latest podcast on Advent that he just released. And we hope that you enjoy the show and that you will start following him and listening to a lot of his excellent content that he's been putting out. This is the Doing Virtue podcast.
A Catholic podcast.
Where virtue is what we do.
Cheers. Dr. Foley, welcome to the Doing Virtue podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be on.
It's really kind of surreal to have you on. I listened to you on the Catholic Man Show, I think in 2018. I think that's the first time that I heard of you. And then my wife actually bought your book, Drinking with the Saints, for me. So I've been using
excellent.
that. I don't want to say that I got into bartending because of you, but she did buy me a bar kit and this book. So for tonight, I'll just say it was because of you.
Well, I would like to say to you, it sounds like you married well.
Yes, indeed, that I did. So you're known for many things, but I would say for Drinking with the Saints is by far the most popular book that you have, but hopefully your other books are also doing well. Recently, within the last couple of years, you wrote Drinking with Saint Nick, and then I know you just wrote a book called Dining with the Saints with Father Leo, and then I think most recently you wrote a book on the Latin liturgy. Is that right?
That is correct, yes. So Dining with the Saints, which I co-wrote with Father Leo Petalinghung, who's a wonderful priest, celebrity chef, has his own cooking show on EWTN. So Dining with the Saints came out earlier this year, February. And then most recently, I have a book that is a series of meditations on some of the prayers of the old Roman Missal.
And what was the inspiration for writing that book?
It started out as a series.
No.
It started out as a series on new liturgical movement. For each Sunday of the year, I would look at one of the prayers that was used for that occasion. And as I finished the year, I thought, this would actually make a good book. And so I took all those and re-edited them and turned it into a book. So that's how it came about.
That's fantastic. I did want to ask you, before we get into maybe a couple of your books more specifically, in Drinking with the Saints, right at the very beginning, you talk about how drinking is really an essential part of living a liturgical life. Did you find that you got a lot of kickback from Catholics on that? Because our show isn't really big enough to be widely criticized, but I have floated the idea of drinking bourbon on a podcast and talking with my friends, and people think that that's kind of silly, or they think that maybe that's not a temperate idea. Did you experience some of that when you first released your book?
A little bit, but not that much. I mean, I never say that drinking is essential to a liturgical life, but it is a normal part, at least according to the Bible. Drinking is a normal part of human culture, and that includes religious culture. So most of the blowback I got from fellow Catholics was from people who never actually read the book. So one very angry old man emailed me and accused me of glorifying the consumption of alcohol. And so I said, gosh, I'm really sorry. Can you please tell me in what part of the book do I do that? And he said, well, I haven't read it. And so I said, have you ever heard the old saying, you can't judge a book by its cover? And honest to God, I think he hadn't.
Did you send him a
copy? That was kind of the
free?
level of criticism I was getting.
I really like how you start off at the beginning of the book by outlining the different parts of kind of how we should approach drinking, and you have a couple of different things. So you talk about how moderation, gratitude, memory, merriment, and ritual are all really key factors in how we should approach drinking, and I've never really heard it outlined that way. I think a lot of Catholics do, the ones that aren't critical of drinking and understand how it needs to be within moderation, and I think they get the first point of moderation, aka we should not get drunk, but they don't really go much beyond that. And I like how you outlined those. Are those points that you came up with on your own, or did you draw from maybe like Joseph Pieper or other people who have written on fasting and feasting and merriment and things like that?
Those 5 talking points were things that I learned in the course of researching these cocktail books. Because when I did the cocktail books, the whole point was to answer the question, what to drink for certain liturgical occasions. What surprised me, though, was that I ended up getting lessons in how to drink. And I just saw these recurring themes, and you just mentioned them. The obvious one is moderation. It's not only the most ethical thing to do, it's also the most pleasurable. And when you eat and drink to excess, you're getting a diminishing return on your investments. So moderation, of course, but also I saw the theme of gratitude come up again and again. That when you drink or do anything, you should do it with a feeling of gratitude to God. And then similarly, with a sense of memory. There's a very big difference between drinking to remember and drinking to forget. That's a distinction that Hilaire Belloc and Chesterton both made, and I think it's a very important one. And then I also mentioned drinking with merriment. I make a distinction between fun and merriment. It's not like there's anything wrong with fun. Fun is fun, but there's something almost sacred about merriment. It necessitates community. It necessitates fellowship. And so a healthy drinking culture is one that promotes merriment and not just, frat boy fun. And then finally, drinking with ritual. What I mean by that is simply using a toast to transform an amorphous event into a focused get-together. Because when you toast to someone or something, it sort of crystallizes the occasion and adds meaning to it. So all of these things I think are important for a healthy drinking culture.
I feel like one thing that, especially as we started this, one of the main reasons why we started this was really to be able to spend time together, but then also to talk with the great people around Christendom in Front Royal, but then also just like yourself, just trying to just have interesting conversations with people. And one thing we found, because not at this house, but at the house that we all lived at one point, not too long ago, we would have people outside, just guys, and it could be anywhere from 10 to 15 guys, and we would just we'd all have a drink, and there is something about the just having some type of drink, especially like whiskey or like gin and tonics or just kind of anything like that. It's definitely something that we found, and the more we talked about it, elevates the conversation really. and really just being in that environment with these other people. I really do like the point about merriment, just being with other people, like that other community. I think that really does put a finger on what we've experienced, just with, and it's not even, it can be something obviously that if you're in a bad culture you do kind of have to force, but a lot of the time it seems like it just kind of happens if you're all together and it's a good group of people and you're able to just kind of talk about things. So yeah, I really do appreciate that. And then also those other things are fantastic too. But
yeah, I think something that we found was that maybe you've come across this too in your experience, is that men in particular have a hard time just sitting down and talking about something. And so having something that's a bit, I hesitate to say icebreaker, but to have something that's of common interest, like a cigar or whiskey or like a cocktail that you're all excited about, kind of provides this starting point to conversation, because you can always rely back on, it's almost like a substitute for the weather. You know, you can always rely on talking about the weather as like, well, if there's nothing else to talk about, we'll talk about how cold it is. So if there's nothing else to talk about, we can talk about how peaty this whiskey is. But I think it also does allow a sense of relaxation and a sense of merriment, whether you're celebrating something or you're just getting together. It seems to provide kind of an avenue to get at the truth of things much easier than just if you were all sitting in a circle talking about your feelings. Otherwise, with the whiskey or with the drink, it's a bit easier to just get into that naturally. So we've really enjoyed doing that. And then obviously with you and your book and your podcast and all of that, that's exactly what you're trying to do as well, I believe.
I think, and I guess, Dr. Foley, I guess I would ask, so I recently got married almost 6 months ago, and then Anthony recently got married 5 months ago. So is it 5? Is it not 5? Okay, right.
Just a humble brag on his end, I think.
No, well, so one of the things that I've gotten really interested in, especially going to Christendom and kind of like reigniting my faith, is the fact, or the reality of trying to live liturgically. Was that a big part of, I guess, why you started to look into stuff like this? Or I guess, yeah, writing your books, was that, yeah.
Yes, I fell in love with the liturgical year about the same time that I fell in love with the traditional Latin Mass. Okay. I was in my mid-20s, and one of the things that impressed me about the old Mass was what a rich calendar it had. And then I started to read about all these folk customs that developed over the centuries around this calendar. And I thought, wow, there's a lot of really cool stuff. You know, growing up in an average American Catholic family, you knew about Christmas and Easter. But you didn't realize that there were so many wonderful folk customs for 12 months out of the year. So my wife shared this interest. So we got married, we had kids, and we tried to implement these liturgical customs in our home. But we also enjoyed an evening drink together. We would call it adult swim. We'd keep the kids away while we caught up on each other's day, and then we'd reconnect with the family and have dinner. So basically, it was only a matter of time before we brought those two loves together, the love of the evening drink and the love of the liturgical year. And we still love to do those other customs as well, but I got to tell you, baking a cake for a saint is a wonderful thing. But making a cocktail for a saint is a heck of a lot easier.
Yeah.
And payoff is faster. So
yeah, right. Yeah, no, that's amazing.
So recently I was watching a video that you were in that Mass of the Ages posted. I think Michael Knowles was the host. How did that come about? I thought that you gave some really interesting insights on the Old Mass, particularly when you were talking about the difference between what is holy and what is sacred. But I'm just interested, did they just reach out to you about that, or have you been in contact with them on other projects?
I don't know how they first got in touch with me, but they did get in touch with me for the Mass of the Ages 3-part documentary. Right. They've already released the first 2 parts, and then the third part I think is being released in early 2024. So So I had contact with them, and then they just contacted me out of the blue and said, "Oh, would you like to be on this thing? It's in this particular format." So we did it, and it was really fun. Michael Knowles is just as warm and genuine a person in person as he is, on air, so to speak. He's a really nice guy.
That's sweet.
Fantastic.
He does seem to be someone who meets your level of class. I think I started the video and I saw your bow tie, and I was like, okay, good. He's in the right place. Both of the Michaels are in their element.
There were a few bow tie jokes exchanged. That is correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that you sort of fell in love with the Latin Mass in your earlier 20s. So did that mean you sort of grew up with the Novus Ordo and kind of, I don't know, if you could tell the story sort of how the traditional Latin Mass kind of grew into your life?
Yeah, it was by accident. I grew up Catholic, cradle Catholic, grew up with the Novus Ordo, didn't know there was an alternative. I'd always just assumed that the new Mass was simply a translation of the old Mass, and maybe they moved the direction of the altar. So I was completely shocked, and in my mid-20s, and I was getting a PhD in Catholic theology at the time, and I didn't know how radical a change had been made, because we didn't study liturgy. We were studying other stuff. And I'll be honest with you, the very first time I went to a Latin Mass, it was a low Mass in Boston, where I was studying at the time. And, the people never gave the responses. The priest kind of mumbled. His voice wasn't very clear. And I was a little turned off. But I have to admit, somewhat shamefacedly, one of the reasons why I was turned off is growing up in California, I was used to the Mass being about me.
Yep.
I was used to the Mass pandering to my tastes and my fads in order to keep my attention. And if there was anything clear about that low Mass that I saw, the one thing that was clear is that the priest was much more interested in God than he was in me. So I was a little offended, but I was also intrigued. So I showed up the next Sunday and the next.
Oh my goodness.
And after about 10 times in a row, I got hooked.
That's awesome. I grew up also in California, and a very sort of liberal area, but also similar to Novus Ordo, just kind of being there for myself, or being there, just seeing people, how they sort of, not disrespected, but it just sort of became a thing that they would do on Sunday. I took a Vatican II class at Christendom, and the big thing that Vatican II wanted to achieve was active participation. And it seems to me like the active participation isn't really a lifting your heart more to God. It is more of a I'm able to respond. I'm able to sort of know what's going on perfectly, which you can do in the traditional Latin Mass. And it was fortunate that my brother started to sort of look into the Latin Mass, and now it's just something that I love and go to regularly. That's awesome.
Very cool. Mark, where did you grow up in California?
I was born in Bakersfield, and then I moved to Napa, California.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, but now I'm here.
If you got to live in California, Napa's.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was funny that you said you stumbled upon the Latin Mass one time. The first time I went to a low Mass, it was my freshman year at Christendom, and it was Saturday morning, and I knew there was a 7 a.m. Mass in the chapel, so I was like, okay, I want to get up and I want to go. So, but I had no idea it was a Latin Mass. So I remember walking in and sitting there and being like, I have no idea what's happening right now. It was the first time I'd ever experienced it. I'm actually also from California, a little closer to where I think, closer to LA. So I think, that's where you're from?
Yes, I'm from the Inland Empire.
Okay.
So
okay.
I grew up in Chino. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so, but yeah, no, that's funny that you mentioned that, because that was, I'm still right now, my wife and I have started to, our interest has grown more and more into the Latin Mass. So it is a little bit gradual. We are trying to kind of go more often, but it was just funny that you said that was how you stumbled upon it, because that's exactly what I did.
I'll buy you his new book, Brian.
Yes, please. Honestly, I'm down.
And then I'll let you know when he fully transitions over to the old mass. One thing I did want to ask you, in that interview that I mentioned, Mass of the Ages with Michael Knowles, you made the distinction between sacred and holy. And I just wanted to ask for some clarification on that. I think you said that holy is something that it's a term that we use for something that's set apart from, and sacred is something that's actually holy in itself, or something along those lines.
The opposite.
Oh, it's the opposite. Okay, so
Yeah.
Sacred is something that's set apart. Holy is something that's holy in itself. Okay, that makes more sense. I had never really heard of that distinction before, but that does make sense when you think about sacred objects and you think about holy days and you think about kind of the different labels that we give to things. But I think nowadays people, as I just did, mix them up. They don't really see a distinction. And so I think that's actually a really important distinction. Would you mind elaborating on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And Christianity is one of the few places where this distinction happens, and it's been blurred in part because of the Protestant Reformation, because the Reformation kind of declared war on the very idea of the sacred, of sacred images, sacred sacraments, sacred vessels. So, but the distinction is very important. Holiness primarily pertains to living beings, persons, whether they're human, angelic, or divine, right? Because holiness is a perfect conformity to the will of God. And St. Paul always describes holiness as sort of the inbreathing of the Holy Spirit. So holiness is about the sanctification of persons. The sacred deals with physical things. Not that human persons aren't physical, but like sacred times, sacred objects, sacred spaces, sacred offices. Like we do call the priesthood holy orders, because the priest does receive the Holy Spirit when he's ordained. But some languages refer to it as sacred orders, which is just as appropriate because they're consecrated for a special use. And there is overlap, and we even have a word for that overlap: sacrosanct. Like the word in the Latin Mass that's used for the Eucharist more than any other word is sacrosanct, which means both sacred and holy, because the Eucharist is both. It certainly is sacred, it's set apart, but then it's also holy because it's the living Christ. So yeah, there are two very big differences between these. And of course, our goal as Christians is to be holy. Having greater access to the sacred doesn't necessarily make you holier. Just ask Dante. There are a lot of popes in his Inferno writhing in hell.
Right.
They had maximum access to the sacred. It did not make them holy. Our goal is to become holy. However, the sacred does play an important role in our sanctification. And when the sacred gets in crisis, it is going to affect the rest of our spiritual lives. And I think that's the crisis we're in now.
Yeah, I definitely agree. We had a podcast not too long ago where we were talking about cathedrals, and the guest that we had on mentioned that he was talking to Peter Criste about cathedrals, and Peter Criste said that until Catholics actually accept the Eucharist, or accept that the true presence is there at Mass, we'll never build a cathedral again. Because if we actually realized what was there, we would sacrifice everything we have, we would give everything to the church, we would quit our jobs, we would build these awesome cathedrals. At least everyone that could do that would. And I think it's pretty apparent when you have 1 out of 3 Catholics that don't believe in the true presence, how I think in many ways ecumenism has become this thing where we look at all religions as just different aspects of Christianity, and somehow Catholicism has gotten thrown in there also as just a religion. It's just becoming watered down. And I think that unfortunately, even though a lot of the Vatican II documents were really beautiful, and I think we're trying to cause change in the church for good, a lot of the aftermath wasn't immediately addressed, and now you have all of these liturgies that really are not much different than a Protestant service, and then you add in bad architecture, bad catechism, all of these things. Eventually it really doesn't look like Catholicism. So then when you act like, as Brian was saying, you walk into an old mass or maybe a high mass on a feast day or something, and it's completely different than anything you've ever experienced, but that's all the church knew for 1,500 years. So I think that's why it seems like there's this big resurgence back to tradition, back to the old mass. And I really like how your book, Drinking with the Saints, in a sense ties that in, because it makes you look into these great saints that did all of these things in a church and in a time where the old mass was the mass of the ages, where that was the sacrament, where that was where you would go weekly to get the Eucharist. And then also tying it with cocktails, just, it's kind of the cherry on top, because, you get to enjoy a cocktail you've never had before and talk about a saint you've never heard of. And you also do a really good job of, mixing in liqueurs that are from the certain area that the saint is from, or maybe there's like a play on words. Or I think I was listening to a podcast trying to prepare for this interview, and there was I think there's a drink you made called like the lizard skin or something like that, like just some really kind of crazy cocktail, but you found it and you applied it to a saint that had like skin disease or something like that, and it was like, oh yeah, this is also like wholesome, funny, and it makes sense. Like we should really all be approaching the lives of the saints in kind of this jovial, human way, because I think a lot of times saints become this distant, something that we could never be a saint, and then you realize that a lot of the saints, well, really all of the saints, were just sinners like us trying to make their way through life.
No, that's absolutely right. Gosh, so many things to say. Number one is, yes, even the cocktail can be sacred, so we should respect the cocktail. But the more serious point is, all the saints are saints because they were holy, each in their own unique way. And they're very different kinds of holiness. The holiness of St. Francis de Sales is different than the holiness of St. Francis of Assisi. But I will say this, the one thing all the saints had in common besides their holiness is that there's never been a saint in the history of the church that did not have a proper respect for the sacred. And we have Catholics today who do lack a proper reverence for the sacred. And that's a problem. You're right about Vatican II. It certainly wasn't the intention to desacralize our religion. But in the aftermath of Vatican II, when you get things like the removal of sacred images, the demotion of the tabernacle, the ripping out of the communion rails, every single one of those things was considered, wait for it, sacred. And so when you get rid of sacred things, it looks like you're, again, wait for it, desacralizing. Nothing is sacred anymore. And that leads to a religious crisis.
One of the blessings of being sort of able to go to Christendom was their mass is the Novus Ordo, but they do a very good Novus Ordo, as much Latin as there can be, and there's a altar rails ad orientem. The majority of the United States, probably the world, doesn't have that. I'm wondering if what your thoughts are on kind of what's the best way to sort of revitalize within the Novus Ordo sort of the faith, or even just belief in the true presence. Like it seems to me like there's a massive overhaul that needs to happen, but I'm wondering what your take is on.
It's true, and I think actually some areas of the world are doing better. In Africa and South America, they will receive very reverently on the tongue. I think that's an important acknowledgement of the sacred. Mm-hmm. Good art and good architecture, a properly oriented church, a communion rail that demarcates this this line between heaven and earth, which is not a wall between us. Don't think of it as a wall. It's not a wall that separates heaven and earth. It's a seam that unites heaven and earth. The communion rail actually is a unifying architectural element. When you have a big church in the round and there's all these steps and you never really know where the nave begins and the sanctuary begins, that's disorienting. That puts you kind of psychologically off balance. So yeah, some of those sacred elements could go a long way into making us aware of what we're celebrating, regardless of the form of the rite.
It's really interesting, especially in our Old Testament class at Christendom. One of the big things that stuck with me is the similarity between the tabernacle in the desert and what the church is supposed to be like. So so where you first step in, and this is where I think it's this is where the holy things are, or I think it's the holy things so that people can go there, and then the second one is where the sacred things are, and then the third is where the Holy of Holies is. And so one of the things that what you just said, I totally think after I was learning this, I definitely had a reversion kind of coming to Christendom and then just going through all the classes, just like such vibrant classes, such vibrant community that totally helped with that. But with that, it just opened my eyes to that, obviously how different, or maybe not how different, but Catholicism and Christianity is definitely almost like a going forth from the Judaism. Obviously, we have we have Christ and we have the fullness of it, but how similar the tabernacle. Just thinking of what the tabernacle looked like, and then now what our chapel looks like, but then also what really beautiful chapels look like. And I don't know. I couldn't agree more with the way that chapels and cathedrals, how they're built. I feel like that definitely just, again, as you said before, it doesn't make us holy, but it allows us that kind of opportunity to kind of take it and then kind of move forward with it, and just to kind of be around it. So yeah, I totally agree.
Brian, you mentioned studying all of these things in school. I wanted to ask, Dr. Foley, what caused you to go to Boston University, first of all, and then how did you end up at Baylor? Those are two very different places with very different, because Baylor is a Baptist university, right?
It is indeed. It's the world's oldest and largest Baptist university. And it was Boston College that I went to, which is a Jesuit institution. The other nickname for BC is Barely Catholic.
Unfortunately, a lot of colleges could have that nickname.
Yeah, exactly. But I wanted to continue. I studied theology as an undergraduate, and I really was kind of dissatisfied, or at least I still had questions. So I wanted to go on to grad school. I chose BC just kind of on a lark. It's amazing how good God was to me. I really had no idea what I should be looking for in a solid graduate program. But I went to BC, and there are a lot of teachers at BC who aren't very orthodox. But I happened to fall in with Father Matt Lamb, who later became the founder of the graduate program in theology at Ave Maria University. Okay. And anyway, he became my faculty advisor and kind of steered me in the right direction. So I had a wonderful education, and I'm very grateful for it. And then after I got my PhD, a job in Baylor, at Baylor University, opened up. And Baylor is in Waco, Texas. And this was in the year 2004. So Waco, thanks be to God, has had a sort of reputation reboot thanks to Chip and Joanna Gaines and Magnolia. But in 2004, Waco meant only one thing, and it was David Koresh and the whole, federal catastrophe with the Branch Davidians. So I've been in Catholic school my entire life, from first grade to PhD. And I see this job offer in Waco, Texas, at a Baptist university, and I'm thinking, no way. But I had two Catholic friends at Baylor, and they said, it's fantastic here. You have to give it a shot. So I did. And I came here and I fell in love with it, and thanks be to God, they offered me a job. But if you had asked me, when I was getting a PhD in Catholic systematic theology, that you're going to be teaching in Waco, Texas at a Baptist university, and you're going to love it, I would say, what are you smoking?
How long were you teaching at Baylor before you decided to write Drinking with the Saints?
Well, I definitely made sure I had tenure at the Baptist University. And to be truthful, that really wasn't part of the consideration. To get tenure, you got to write books that are more serious than cocktail books. So I focused on those first, and then I had a little lag time, and I came upon the idea with the help of my wife. And then just for the next year, it really was a very organic process. I would just try to keep 1 week ahead of the calendar. And every Monday, I had a group of friends that I would email. And then there were about 30 friends across the country. I had some very eager collaborators. And every Monday, I would send the week's recipes and say, give me your feedback. And that's basically how we made the book.
Wow.
Nice.
Being at Baylor, I know you said earlier that you didn't get much pushback with writing the book or when you were writing the book. Was that different at Baylor? Because, not all, I guess maybe I'm conflating other Protestant groups and Baptists, but my thought of Baptists is that they're maybe not a huge fan of like alcohol or consuming alcohol. Is that correct? It could be wrong.
That is historically correct.
Okay.
The two things that Southern Baptists especially are renowned for is their opposition to dancing and their opposition to drinking.
Okay.
But it's complicated. Unlike the Mormons, who are very clear that alcohol is forbidden, there was never anything in the Baptist life that said you cannot drink. But there was just this kind of strong social stigma if you did drink. So the old joke is that there are three immutable truths of religion. The first is that Jews will never recognize Jesus as the Messiah. The second is that Protestants will never recognize the Pope as the Vicar of Christ. And the third is that Baptists will never recognize each other in a liquor store.
That's hilarious.
But interestingly enough, in the 20 years that I've been at Baylor, both among evangelical Protestants and Baptists, I've seen a really big change in their attitude towards alcohol. Like the grandparents would be teetotalers. The parents will have a glass of wine maybe once a month. And then the children are foodies. And they know the flavor profile of different microbrews. It's really interesting.
I wanted to ask you, I want to be respectful of your time, so when you need to head out, just let us know. But I did want to ask you, when did you decide to start writing other books that were, I guess you would call them sequels to Drinking with the Saints? Because with Drinking with the Saints, I'm sure right as you published it, you thought, oh, I should have done this, or I skipped this saint, or this cocktail is actually really great. And but right, it seems like within the next couple of years after that, you have Drinking with Saint Nick, you have Drinking with Your Patron Saints, then you recently released Dining with the Saints. So were those just kind of, as time goes on, you realize you have enough material for another book, or was that something that from the start you were planning on kind of seeing how the first one went, and then if it went well, to continue to publish about these topics?
No, I had no aspirations for a sequel when I wrote Drinking with the Saints. I had no idea it would become so popular. I just wrote it because I thought it was a hilarious idea, and I wanted to be able to pull it off.
like Michael Knowles' Blank Book.
Yes, exactly.
Kind of a similar story, except you actually have words.
Exactly. So then I thought, so the other ideas just sort of came organically. So the Christmas book builds upon some of the stuff in Drinking with the Saints, but I have drinks for every day of the Advent and Christmas seasons. Let's go. And then the Patron Saints book is really fun because it's organized thematically. You see who your patron saint is, and then you find the drink and raise a glass to him. And then I'm very grateful that I got to write Dining with the Saints with Father Leo, because it did occur to me, after all that drinking, I should probably have some food.
And you talk about, or you mentioned at the beginning, and I've also heard you say it other other podcast episodes and everything, but it's easier to make a cocktail than to bake a cake or to bake a thing. So I haven't looked at your Dining with the Saints. So is that something that you kind of, obviously, as you just said, just kind of, well, I think I should probably eat something, so I should start thinking about food. Was it something that in your family you started to do, or was that just kind of a necessary outflowing from this first one?
So the way it worked was there are already dozens of actually very fine Catholic cookbooks on the market, and have been for 80 years. There's a long history of Catholic cookbooks. And it's great. It's an important part of our culture. But what we did with Dining with the Saints is we wanted to update some of these recipes. So we've got St. Andrew's Day coming up. The big traditional meal for St. Andrew's Day in Scotland, and he's the patron saint of Scotland, is sheep's head. Yay, sheep's head.
Yum.
Okay.
How many Americans are going to have sheep's head for St. Andrew's Day? I'm just, so we're like, nah, let's come up with something else. God love the tradition, but it doesn't have to be universal at all times. So the way it worked was I came up with the saint stories and traditional suggestions that I found, combing the history books. And then I gave that to Father Leo, and then he came up with the recipe. Oh, nice. And it really was the perfect partnership, because as much as I enjoy food, you don't want an Irishman in the kitchen. Right? Like, I'm good behind the bar, but you don't trust Father Leo.
Yeah, it seems like you're on the trajectory to maybe have a book called like Driving with the Saints. You have a couple cocktails and then how to drive safely after. I don't know if that's in the works, but I'd be happy to help you out editing if you'd like. I wanted to ask you, this book, Drinking with Saint Nick, you advocate for not drinking every day of Advent, but to drink on kind of the special days. And I think it seems like in particular you advocate for really trying to get back into the tradition of celebrating, obviously, St. Nicholas's feast day, but more specifically the 12 days of Christmas. And I think that that's something that's really been overlooked in the last 50 years, probably more. I think most people know the song 12 Days of Christmas, but they probably couldn't even tell you what, all the different types of birds that are in that song. That might be the bare minimum. Like, I think most people don't even know why it's 12 Days of Christmas. What's that, anything. So was part of the inspiration for this book trying to revitalize the sense of the Christmas celebration as well, not just Advent?
That is true. And that point, it comes out more strongly in a book that I published last Christmas time and is currently available on Amazon. Why We Kiss Under the Mistletoe, Christmas Traditions Explained. And I did a deep dive into all the Christmas customs and folklore. And it was fascinating to see how Christmas has changed as a holiday, even within the Christian world. Even before it got secularized, there were changes in the way Christians celebrated the holiday. But one of the things there have been, and lest we bemoan all of the secular Christmas stuff, there actually have been some good developments in modernity regarding the celebration of Christmas. For example, it's more family friendly and child oriented. In the Middle Ages, it was Adult Swim hardcore partying with not a lot of gift giving.
Oh wow!
It was just a time to enjoy the winter harvest and indulge. You still went to mass 3 times on Christmas, but it was pretty raucous, and it was not very domestic. So there have been some progresses, but you mentioned the 12 days of Christmas. I think one of the big losses is that now in our modern age, the Christmas season seems to begin earlier and earlier each year.
Yeah.
Like now it's a miracle when you don't hear a Christmas song until the day after Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Right? I asked my class this year, I said, did you do anything special for Halloween? And one of my students joked, yeah, I put up the Christmas tree.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for myself. I'm currently celebrating Christmas of next year just to get ahead of the marketing schedule, you know?
Yeah, exactly. No, it's so true. So the problem with that approach is when you start the season earlier and earlier, by the time you get to December 25th, you're sick of Christmas.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? But so the older approach was much better. Let Advent be a time of joyful restraint. There is restraint, but it's still joyful. And there's still things like Christmas caroling. But let it be more or less a time of restraint. And then the 12 days of Christmas come between December 25th and January 6th, and you pull out all the stops. And you have 12 days of merrymaking. That is a much healthier model.
I guess one thing, especially with Advent coming, and I think over the last couple of years, it's definitely, as you said, it's become more in my head that it isn't that Christmas doesn't start until Christmas Day. So like we have this whole time for Advent. So like the more I'm just kind of like with this and just like looking into traditions and everything, what are a couple, I guess, or maybe just a few traditions that you do for Advent, or even, I guess merely just Advent, because that's coming up right now, and then obviously if we still have time, then Christmas. But
well, Brian, let me answer Advent. Then, unfortunately, I need to run.
Okay, no, that's okay.
But I don't do anything particularly unique. The Christmas, the Advent candles, the Advent wreath is a very wonderful tradition. The Jesse tree is another one. Okay. There aren't a lot of specific Advent customs other than those 2 biggies.
Okay.
But the importance is just sort of getting into the spirit of the season
and getting ready for Christ's coming. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
Amen. Dr. Foley, thank you so much for coming on. I wanted to quickly mention you have a pilgrimage coming up to Croatia. That sounds like a lot of fun. We'll make sure that we post a link to that in the show notes and when we post this on Instagram. If people want to contact you, I believe you have an email. It's technically for your podcast, but it's podcast@drinkingwiththesaints.com. Is that right?
That is correct. And you can find more information on the cruise also on the website, drinkingwiththesaints.com.
Fantastic. And we didn't really talk about it, but you and your wife do have a podcast called Drinking with the Saints. So we'd like to ask all of our listeners to go ahead and check that out. They have a lot of really interesting episodes. It doesn't take that long, and they have a cocktail and talk about a really interesting saint. So would highly recommend that. Dr. Foley, thank you so much for coming on the Doing Virtue podcast. We really look forward to sending it to you, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Absolutely. Have a blessed evening, and have a blessed Advent.
Thank you. You too.
Cheers.
Take care. Cheers.